Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, maybe you've been hearing something about a WHO treaty or have seen the hashtag Stop the Treaty trending on social media. Maybe you read this article in the Washington Post claiming the conspiracy theorists are at it again. Figures such as Russell Brand, former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, and even Senator Marco Rubio had been making the rounds, popularizing an idea that the WHO technocrats would have the ability to override the U.S. Constitution, thwart our democracy, and gain control over our nation's health policy. That these unelected globalists would be in charge of our nation's pandemic response from here on out. Get ready for more lockdowns, vaccine passports, mandatory contact tracing, and quarantine zones imposed on us by elites sitting in Geneva, with the U.S. government left neutered, unable to save us from this medical tyranny. Okay. So that all sounds really scary. So what does all of this mean, and what's the truth about what's actually happening? Well, this week, the 75th World Health Assembly is being held in Geneva, Switzerland. Now, the World Health Assembly is the governing body of the WHO. It's made up of appointed delegates from pretty much every recognized country in the world. And these delegates get together to discuss concerns and ideas, come up with solutions, and sometimes vote on agendas. One thing that has obviously come up is the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, many countries feel like the pandemic wasn't handled properly by other countries. And because of this, there's a desire amongst some to amend the international health regulations. Now, the international health regulations is a legally binding agreement by the WHO member nations that directs countries on what they need to do in the event of a possible public health crisis. The idea is to spot potential events and alert the WHO and other countries of these events. The IHR agreement, which was first crafted in 1969 and last amended in 2005, outlines each member nation's responsibilities. Now, I say it's legally binding, but first of all, the WHO has no police power. If a country doesn't comply, there isn't much anyone can do. Secondly, the current version of the agreement is soft in its language. It doesn't say anything about what a country must do. It instead uses language that suggests what a country should do. So when a country doesn't do what is suggested, like China, for example, not coming forward with its information about COVID-19, there isn't anything anyone can do except complain. There's no enforcement mechanism to the IHR agreement. Now, this is what the WHO wants to change. The WHO wants some sort of police power. They say they need to be armed with some ability to motivate non-compliant countries. However, countries like the U.S. don't really want to give the WHO any such power. After all, the U.S. could end up on the list of countries not adhering to the contract. Plus, can you trust the WHO? Will they go after all equally, or will they favor countries that donate more to their organization over others? Will they use their police power strictly by the book, or will they use it at the behest of some of their largest private donors, like Bill Gates, to enforce their personal agendas? After all, Bill Gates is the WHO's second largest donor, the first being the United States. But Gavi, the vaccine organization, is also a very large donor to the WHO, and Bill Gates is a massive donor to Gavi. The combined donations from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi to the WHO are actually larger than what the U.S. gives, making Bill Gates theoretically the number one donor to the WHO. Now, one billionaire has a disproportionate amount of influence over global health. Should he also have a disproportionate amount of influence over an organization that is then given police power to go after non-compliant countries? The U.S. has other ideas. The U.S. has given the WHO a set of proposed amendments to the IHR. The thing that stands out is the U.S. suggests changing any sort of non-binding suggestive language, words like consult or recommend, with more binding words like must and shall. So the document, if adopted to the U.S.'s suggestions, would sound much more binding. Now, it's important to note that there is nothing about pandemic responses like lockdowns, quarantines, or vaccines in the current IHR or the proposed amendments. The language is vague, and it gives a lot of power to the WHO to decide on how events should be handled. But again, the current language says the WHO will make suggestions and will consult with member states. The new language would be more binding. It would be particularly binding if the WHO also has police power. But again, countries like the U.S. don't want to grant it. So then, is the U.S. government actually the good guys in all of this? If they don't want to grant the globalist technocrats at the WHO police power, are we being protected by our guys? Well, yes and no. Yes, the U.S. has no interest in giving any entity, especially one not directly controlled by the U.S. government itself, any sort of police power. Remember all of the accusations that the WHO is controlled by China. So after all, Taiwan, for example, is not a recognized country to the WHO because China doesn't want them to be. But the U.S. is calling for much harsher language to be adopted into the IHR. Now, why would the government do that if they don't intend to give the WHO police power? Well, because the U.S. intends to use the agreement as a reason to sanction or go after countries in other ways, countries who are deemed to be non-compliant. But of course, you can bet that the only countries seeing any sort of consequences will be those not friendly to the U.S. So nothing is being decided on this week. The Assembly is discussing and might agree on some points, but likely won't on others. The process to adopt a newly amended IHR actually takes years. Now, they expect the new agreement won't be voted on until sometime in 2024. But people are right to sound the alarm about this. There is a push by the WHO to gain police power over pandemic responses. And right now, it's just an idea. But sometimes ideas become reality, especially if those ideas are supported by very wealthy donors who can use their money to sway votes from assembly members. Also, if you're not a U.S. citizen, you could have reason to fear the U.S. will weaponize public health as a way to go after enemy nations. We've seen this done in the name of human rights and in the name of climate change. It stands to reason it will also happen in the name of public health. And if the U.S. isn't the one doing it, then another powerful nation like China might. So that is what's really kind of going on right now with this whole stop the treaty and the treaty that is being discussed, the amendments. Some countries have come forward, like Brazil, saying we're not signing this thing. And, Brazil has kind of taken that tone about other treaties because they do feel like powerful, larger countries often use these sorts of, like climate change, human rights, to go after countries, to harm them, to limit them, to sanction them, using it more as a bully tactic to get their way and to remain on top and to remain powerful rather than actually doing it for the benefit of the global, greater good. So, even though right now no one's going to vote on anything, and this is something that's just in discussion that is going to be voted on later, I do think it's right for people to sound the alarm and say, hey, wait a minute, we're not so keen on what some of these things are and what some of the ideas are. I mean, it'll be too late once they actually draft it and they're ready to vote in 2024 on this to actually adopt it. Now would be the time to start saying, I don't know how fair this thing is. Do we really want to give the WHO police power? What kind of police power would they be granted? And again, it's vague over, because it doesn't specify what you would have to do as a country or not have to do. It would be just up to the discretion of the WHO. I don't know anybody on either side of the aisle that honestly should be okay with that. Whether if you're, for example, really worried about China and the influence of China, I don't know if you'd want to grant WHO police power when they do seem to be so heavily influenced by China, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's a lot in here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of what's going on, and
yeah, that would be my exact response to it. We don't want to be influenced by China in that regard, and also, domestically, there's so much selective support for internationalism and globalism when it comes to public health rules. There's so much they're doing everything better everywhere else, but actually the World Health Organization was far more less restrictive on masks for children than our CDC was, but that didn't. So even though that was the case, that didn't cause our health officials to go, oh well, we need to do what the WHO does, right? They didn't care. Right. So they only care if it's more restrictive.
Well, right, and China also didn't care what the WHO said, which is why the U.S. is now drafting language. So the U.S. is actually...
The WHO was doing cover for them.
Right. So
doing cover
really
for
clear,
the safety, the lab safety.
Exactly. So it's really clear to me that the U.S.'s amendments to this IHR, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, but it looks like they're drafting this to be harsher in order to actually go after China. So the U.S. is wanting to, because China is where a lot of these viruses crop up. So the U.S. looks like they're wanting to utilize public health policy as a way to then go after China, sanction China. Whether you think that's right or wrong, that is what it looks like the U.S. is wanting to do. On the flip side, the WHO is asking for the police power. The U.S. is saying, I don't know if I want to give that to you because it could be used in the reverse. And so the WHO is asking for police power, and that then raises concerns because the WHO we don't know who exactly influences WHO. We have some good ideas. So Bill Gates absolutely does have a lot of influence over the WHO. That's been reported on for years. A disproportionate amount of their agenda is Bill Gates' agenda because it's heavily funded by him. So what he wants done, like polio eradication, that's what they do. So then people wonder, do we really want, if Bill Gates doesn't get his agenda, that, like if countries aren't compliant with vaccination programs like he wants, could then the WHO go after them because he wants them to? So there's a lot, I think, to be worried about. What do you think, Bree?
Is there any risk, I'm curious, of their actually promulgating police power? What does that look like? They're going to hire recruit people from countries that look like UN peacekeeping troops? That seems like a really significant undertaking. Is that realistically something that is even in the mind's eye at this point?
That's not actually in the discussion at this point, but of course anything goes, right? Because it's just a discussion, so they could throw out anything. But right now the WHO is asking for more power, more like the power to sanction and to harm countries financially or to withhold certain, to say, well, we're going to withhold, XYZ things from you collectively. So the WHO would be able to mandate the sanctioning that then the countries would have to adhere to, or mandate, the withholding of certain services or resources because the country's deemed non-compliant. I don't know how you would give the WHO any sort of police power. I think what's more likely is what the U.S. is actually asking for a number of reasons. But that being that then the bigger, more powerful countries would then be the enforcers, essentially. And it's the same thing like what we see with climate change, for example, similar tactics being used. But again, are they going to use it on their friends or just their enemies?
Yeah, it's frustrating with these international treaties. So many of them America hand-wrings about and moralizes about, but doesn't itself belong to, won't sign on to the Universal Declaration for the Rights of the Child because we don't guarantee some basic human rights for children in this country. We're a country so low among its peers in terms of our own willingness to extend basic healthcare, universal healthcare access. We're the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And yet, whether you live or die in this country depends on how much money is in your bank account. And so it does feel very rich to kind of lean on international treaties as a way to shame, embarrass, or sanction other places around the world. I'm not sure, how likely it is that this is going to happen or come down the pike, but it certainly is an interesting thought experiment to shed light on the hypocrisy of our own country.
Yeah, and and I do want to also point out that right now, I know a lot of people in the United States are saying, hey, this is going to override our sovereignty and override our democracy. It's not as likely when you're the most powerful country in the world, right? The power country gets to actually be the ones sanctioning and going after other countries. But that dynamic could flip at any time. I mean, it could become very quickly that China becomes the greatest world power. And if that's the case, then they would be the ones that would have the policing power, essentially, because they're the big bad bully that gets to use it. So you always have to be careful, when you're trying to get your own power, who else is going to use it against you?
Yeah, well, and even if it's exactly as you just said, that this is, so controlled by, we're the power, so it's controlled by us, so we have less to fear. Well, who's the we in that, right? That our U.S. government is dictating that, but they don't necessarily represent the wishes of me or you or other people who have different ideas about COVID and some of the public health measures that have been taken. So that should be cold comfort even without the additional wrinkle that you just mentioned, which is also a good one.
Could be, big money interests, exactly. So there's a lot to be concerned about. Granting more police power to anybody, I think, is always something to be very concerned about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Kim. And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.